Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. Thank y'all for having me here to talk about this guy. Uh, I want to tell you a little bit of background about myself, just real quick. I grew up in Florence, graduated from Bradshaw High School. Rest in peace. And then 2 years at UNA. Well, from there I went to Auburn, graduated with a chemical engineering degree in 1985. At that point, I left the area to pursue my career, raised a family. Was fortunate enough to retire a few years ago and move back to this area. I always loved this area. There's so much history. The area is as beautiful as any place you can go, so it wasn't hard for me to come back. Since this is Genealogy Club, I don't get to talk about this much, or society, I should say, but I'm a fourth German immigrant, St. Florine, St. Joe area. And then I'm related to the Thomas Gresham, Revolutionary War soldier, and the Greshams from Mars Hill. And then a lot of families from East and Central Lauderdale County, those names. I was fortunate enough to marry outside the area, so therefore I know I didn't marry a third or fourth cousin, as most of y'all know. All right, so let's get started just a little bit. Right here, I want to say a real thank you to this organization. The Reynolds, my direct ancestor, Thomas Hamilton Reynolds, all his little brothers fought under Biffle's cavalry, and y'all published Captain Reynolds' diary several years ago. It's been a big help to me in my research. When I first got it in 1995, right, somebody sent it to me. I was living in, I don't know if I was living in Mississippi then, and I thought this ain't no help. And after time went on, I realized how valuable little snippets are when you do genealogical research, when you compare them with something else. And when we look at Hyde stuff, we'll see some of the same things. So, the soldier's lonely grave. This is from the Florence Times, Friday, January 17th, 1913. Killed by a federal gunboat in Florence, 1864. Mr. DeForest Hyde of South Florence, antiquarian, removes the mystery surrounding the grave of the man found on Southwood Avenue recently while workmen were excavating for the stormwater sewer. He communicates the information that the man was killed by a federal gunboat on Christmas Day, 1864, together with two other soldiers. Two of the men that were killed by a federal were interred there, and subsequently one was identified and the body removed. Florence was the center of some stirring times during the war between the states, and this incident is one of many that could be related. Why cannot Mr. Hyde write us the local history of the 4 years of the war? What he kind of did, if you go back and you grab some of these stories he wrote, unfortunately, unless there's a manuscript that never got published that his family may still have, we don't have that record. Oh yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we move on. Okay, so let's start and learn something about his family background. According to DeForest Hyde, his father came to Florence in 1837 from Vermont, and he was a tailor. Shows up in the census records. It also shows up in ads in newspapers. That tailor ad is from the June 27th, 1846 issue of the Florence Gazette. Samuel Hyde married a Mary E. O'Hara, and I'm sure that family has changed it to O'Hara and gotten consistent with everybody else, but that is who, there was a family of O'Haras here apparently. His aunt married a Brown, and she was shown living with the family in 1860. Now, she's important a little bit in some of Forrest's stories because she basically takes care of him during the Civil War, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. She married, I couldn't find Samuel Brown from 1860 on, so I don't know what happened there. She would later marry Mitchell Cockelman in 1878, and that's where she's buried, out in the cemetery that's just west of the Gresham Cemetery out there. There's 2 or 3, but I can't remember which one right offhand. There's a record of a Martin O'Hara in town in 1824, but I found nothing connecting the 2 sisters to him. DeForest claimed in an article that he wrote as The Bohemian that a pot made in Florence was handed down by his grandmother, and I'm assuming this is his maternal grandmother. So obviously the family was here when they got here. That's a Harper's Gazette painting that was published right after what was called the Great Steamboat Chase, which happened when the steamboats, after Fort Henry, came down up the Tennessee into Florence and burned the steamboats and stuff. And it was constructed from Commodore Phelps' report, basically that they were embraced by citizens all along the shores of the Tennessee by Unionists. And so that painting tries to depict that. But however, the Southern papers somewhat painted a different picture. The Memphis Appeal, written by a guy named Att, and I'll pull this line from it, said, got information, talking about the Union sailors, they got information from a man by the name of Hyde, a tailor by trade of Florence, about the Dunbar, the disappearance of which they could not account for, she having been sunk in 50 feet of water and the chimneys thrown overboard. I believe Att was Gus, can't think of Gus's last name, but he was the captain of the Dunbar. Fowler, yeah, Gus Fowler. He was the captain of the Dunbar. That's who I think Att was. And he was upset that occurred. The Gazette, edition written by Samuel Barr, which you see over the left-hand part of the screen, he didn't mention Hyde. But the Tuscumbia paper did. It said, by directions of a bacon-bought Lincolnite, the boats landed at Florence, bursted open the warehouses, and took what they wanted. Now, right after all of this, well, let me read the Daily Huntsville Confederate too. We have made it our special business to find out what aid and comfort the enemy got from Fort Henry to Florence, and have heard of only one man who at Florence went down and showed them where to land and took bacon for his services and hauled it away after night. And so there's a lot of frustration in the community, a lot of frustration because the Southern papers throughout the South were upset that there was this depiction of Southern support for the Unionist cause. And finally, this guy by the name of Charles Bedford, who's buried out here in the Bartwell Cemetery, he wrote a letter to the Charleston Mercury dated February 27th, 1862. I see in your paper of the 18th an extract from the northern one headed an expedition up the Tennessee River. As concerns the account of the joy of the people of Florence at the visit of the gunboats, and upon seeing the old rag, the Stars and Stripes, it is a point-blank, jet-black abolition lie. Not any lads of Florence went to see them or desired to go or had any communication with them. They were held at utter detestation by every soul except one man and his wife, a tailor from Vermont named Hyde, who had been living here so many years. They went down to see them and were glad, but nobody else. A flag of truce was sent to the enemy by the citizens of Florence to know what they wanted, was all the intercourse the people of Florence had with them. The invaders professed to want nothing but government stores and professed, I believe they did respect private property. And then it went on to say, this Vermont friend of theirs was caught that night, the night they left, coming up from the warehouse at the river with a cartload of bacon, and is now confined in jail on the charge of stealing it. Such then are the friends here and elsewhere on the Tennessee River, which they write of as glad to see them. Okay, so years later, after Samuel Hyde's death, DeForest would post a veteran's tribute to his father in a paper called the Toledo Blade, which I'll talk about later. In this article, under the title, Their Last Roll Call, this is what Forrest said about this event. In February 1862, two gunboats came to Florence. My father went aboard one of them, and after leaving the boats, he was met by a gang of Southern chivalry, hustled off to prison, and kept in close confinement until the news was received that the Yankees are coming. And then he was hurried across the river to prison in Lawrence County and not permitted to see his wife, who died while he was confined in prison. He made a note she had consumption. He was released by the 4th Ohio Cavalry, recaptured between Tuscumbia and Cortland, Alabama, escaped inside of an hour, and returned to Company I while in battle line. He afterward was engaged in carrying dispatches and penetrating the lines of the enemy with Turchin and Granger. Afterwards, he was engaged in the hospital, then on into the transportation department. Hyde would then write a little bit about giving a tribute to Governor O'Neill, which I'll talk about later. And then he would say, "My father survived his personal persecutors for opinion's sake, the last one of them, by nearly a year." And then one more thing, he would write in a letter, "Forgive and forget what?" And you can imagine, Hyde is, when all this happened, he was 7 years old. Okay? And this is what he saw. So, very bitter about this. He said, "Shall I forgive those hell-inspired persons who perjury threw my father into prison for the purpose of murdering him with some semblance of law? Shall I forgive those persons who wanted to remove a dying mother from our home into the street and burn the house? Shall I forgive those persons who, with conscript authority, entered the house and took my eldest brother from home to fight the hated Yankees at midnight, dressed in a pair of pants and a bed quilt, the weather bitterly cold?" You know, starting at 7 years old and then going to 10 by the time the war ended, very traumatic for a young boy. So we're going to come back to the war in his writings. We're going to talk about how he gets a career in the newspaper business. This right here is from the January 28th, 1905 Florence Herald, where it shows a picture of the old red brick school. And the reason we have that picture is because DeForest Hyde showed an artist, just like I showed Kurt how to, I give Kurt a sketch and then he draws something, right? Yeah. But anyway, he gave an artist a sketch, and they came up with a picture of the old brick school, which was the first public school in the state of Alabama. And Forrest is where Forrest went to school at.
It later became St. Joseph Catholic Church.
Oh, I didn't know that.
1978.
Good.
Where the old Patton School was.
Okay. On Tuesday, December 19th, 1871, we found that 16-year-old DeForest Hyde is working for the Lauderdale Times. The publisher is Isaac Barr and William Wood, and they gave him positive reviews. I'm going to move through this just a little quick. In 1873, Forrest seems to be an industrious young man of 18. He's trying to make extra money, and he's also shows in the census that he's a printer. So he's moved on to being the guy delivering papers. He's also part of the printing process. So he's doing what people used to do a long time ago. They started at the bottom and worked their way up. I don't see as much as that as I used to. At 19, he's published his first article, a poem called A Carrier's Address. It's 7 stanzas, so I only put basically 4.5 of them up there. And you can read through some of that right there. It's basically a plea that please pay your dues. Notable events in his young life. In 1878, a 23-year-old Hyde marries Miss Martha Davis of South Florence. It also shows, I've got an article, because I never could figure out what his older brother, who was almost conscripted in the winter of 64-65, he had moved north to Indiana, married there, but I didn't find any survivorship after that point, so I don't know what happened to him. He loses his infant son in 1881. They have 3 sons and 1 daughter that survive infancy. And many of their descendants live in the Shoals area, when I went through and looked. So they're around here. One descendant, a Miss Henry Putnam, made a donation to the Florence-Lauderdale Public Library in the memory of Samuel Mills Hyde, according to February 27th, 1983. Was that when they were raising money for this place, Lee, or do you remember?
Well, not this new building. That would have been in the 80s. It might have been the new Genealogy local history department.
Okay.
Who knows?
So this is probably the most important part. This is the hidden stuff about DeForest Hyde. On November 22nd, 1883, John McElroy, a Civil War veteran, started the campfire in the Toledo Blade out of Toledo, Ohio. And he asked for old vets to tell stories of matters pertaining to the great struggle in which we participated. The following year, McElroy became an editor of the National Tribune. It was a very successful paper that dealt with veterans' stories. But the Blade's campfire endured on, and the last column was written in the January 10th issue of the Toledo Blade Weekly in 1986. Starting around September 1890, perhaps earlier, because I'll explain, DeForest Hyde, under the pen name of Bub, writes at least 17 articles, one of which, as I noted earlier, used his real name when he gave his tribute to his dad after his passing in O'Neill. He also writes responses, questions. It's like a bulletin board. What we think of with a bulletin board in early internet days. He's working for the Florence Gazette here, and I can't imagine that Isaac Barr knew anything about it or would have run any of these stories. You agree with that?
Yeah, Barr was pretty gung-ho pro-Confederate.
Yeah.
And a Confederate veteran himself.
Yeah. This is an example of what you do when you're doing research sometimes and looking at newspapers. This is the Google News Archive, and I don't know if Heather Hill of the Toledo Library will get to see this or not, but if she does, I need to give her a shout out and thank you, because as I found just a distinct thing where I could see Bub, I would send her an email and ask her if she would send me a copy of the article, which she has done on countless occasions. I still, despite that though, is I know that there's other articles that I haven't been able to see, and I've got 2 microfilms coming to this library that we'll have for 30 days. And if any of you want to go look through that, you can tell Lee and they'll load them on there. So hopefully we'll discover if he has any more articles. That should be in a week or 2, I hope, right? Samuel Hyde dies at age 82 on November 4th, 1890, during the middle of him, DeForest, writing these articles. It seems the elder Mr. Hyde was beloved by most of Florence, and many thought he had quite a bit of money by the one note. Apparently they were snooping around. He had a lot of property in Florence, and people were out there saying, well, he might have basically during the war buried some of it. 3 days after Hyde's father's passed, Edward O'Neill dies, a Confederate general and later the governor of Alabama. I told you what Hyde wrote about his father in the Toledo Blade, but now I want to tell you what he wrote about Governor O'Neill. On November 7th, an old Confederate veteran also passed away. General E.A. O'Neill, ex-governor of Alabama. He and my father were the warmest of personal friends. O'Neill never persecuted anyone. His heart was too large to do such a thing. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the Federals carried a lot of rebel prisoners to Philadelphia in cars, and while sidetracked, a wounded Federal soldier with his arm in a sling standing by asked, "Do any of you know General O'Neill?" "Yes, yes," was the answer. "Well, if you ever see him, tell him for me, God bless him. He gave me water on the battlefield." Years later, he would pay tribute also, talking about DeForest Hyde, when he was writing as the Bohemian to Captain James Kirkman, writing, "Notwithstanding the differences then existing, he, in a time of stress the fates of war impose, performed an act of kindness the Bohemian never forgot as long as life endures. Captain Kirkman died looking his enemy squarely in the face. He deserved a better, more peaceful fate. And I'm bringing this before we start into the stories to contrast the obvious hate he had for the people who persecuted his father, and his politics were definitely Unionist, but he was fair-minded. He didn't hold grudges against all people that were Confederates, and I think that's important. There's a lot of healing that you see in his writings between the 1890s and after the Spanish-American War, which a lot of historians talk about. That was what brought the nation together, and you especially see that after when he's writing in the Florence Times as the Bohemian. So he had some success with those articles, and it gave him the confidence to get in the newspaper writing business. He and along with 3 others launched a new newspaper called the Lauderdale Gazette. It lasted about 6 months. There's no surviving copies of it. However, we have some reprints that you can find here and there. One which I thought was interesting, where basically they supported women's suffrage. Say it was something that you're not going to stop the tide of progress. And that the paper that printed that was a Miami, Ohio paper. Shortly after, the next year, he joins the Reverend Oliver Ethan Comstock to start another paper called the Reaper, located in Sheffield. Now Comstock was the primary owner and the editor, but Hyde would move up into that paper, and you can recognize that, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, that Comstock got more involved in the religious business, the ministry, and Hyde basically was the driving force of that paper. Comstock, though, published a picture of Hyde along with a lengthy bio just prior to this edition of the Florence Times, which was dated March 11th, 1898. Comstock wrote, "His short paragraphs have brightened the pages of the Reaper from week to week, and his knowledge of the political world stands him in hand. The press has found in him a foeman worthy of their steel, and it gives us pleasure to present his photo to the public." Comstock would go on to say his word was better than a bond, honesty is as pure as gold, and a man without guile. And I really would love to get into the Reaper and his career there, because it spanned 12 years. But I just don't have the time, so I'm going to move on to the next part of his life, which was, well, there is one part I needed to cover. He invents an important fictitious character called Colonel Mickey Aubert. It's important because that's how we link Hyde to the Bohemian. We know Hyde's the editor, and the first instance of Colonel Mickey Aubert shows up in August 1st, 1903 in the Reaper, and Hyde tells that he is a pessimist, and he uses the colonel to show the difference between the progress of Sheffield and the conservative, we don't want to change nature of Florence. And he also talks, in one article, he talked about the gunboats on Christmas Day, which we'll see quite often. On January 1st, 1905, the Reaper shuts down. Hyde has been with that paper 12 years before it shut down. And immediately, 4 months later or so, DeForest takes a job with the Florence Times. His health during this time degrades, and he steps away from an active role from that paper in 1908, 1909. Colonel Mickey Aubert soon reappears on the columns of Random Ramblings, authored by the pen name The Bohemian. And this is important because as a historian, and I've got a professed PhD, so I better watch what I'm saying here since I may be wrong. Rarely will a historian quote a narrative from a pen name unless they know the author, because you don't have any context who this person is. He's like an anonymous source. And knowing that DeForest Hyde is the Bohemian and Bub makes those writings more credible, and they can be evaluated properly for accuracy. And here's an example. On October 30th, 1864, 9-year-old DeForest Hyde would recount The first soldiers to enter the town, and this is when Hood's crossing the river, and a lot of you guys have read either Bill McDonald's version or my version of the death of Andrew DeVilbiss. Right after that occurred, the first soldiers to enter the town marched up the Depot Hill to Alabama Street, thence east to Market, now Wood Avenue, and turned into that street as the Federal cavalry filed into College Street from Market, near the home of the late Samuel F. Hyde. And you can see DeForest peering out some little hole in his house watching all this occur. This was in plain view of each body of men with only the distance of a block intervening, and stray as it may seem, there was no demonstration on either side toward engaging in conflict. Now I'm going to tell you something. Bill McDonald was an excellent historian, and he would have written that in his story if he knew Bohemian was DeForest Hyde and that was an eyewitness piece. That's why this stuff is important. His writings give another element that helps what's the work that's going on with the Mushoes National Heritage Area Civil War Trail. He provides eyewitness stories, color to sometimes dull events, and much needed locations and clues that help with further research. Hyde, writing in his column called Random Ramblings, as the Bohemian said, few towns, if any, in the state have as many points of historical interest as Florence, and not one of them is marked so the passing stranger may know them. He then goes on to say, mark the spot on the roadside where Oliver and Campbell were executed April 1865. And he didn't give us his exact spot, but he came close because he did write a story as Bub about that execution. And when you use that narrative along with a couple others, and I think this agrees with close to what Lee is saying, it was on a little hollow off the military road about a mile outside of town from where the proceedings took place, which makes you think the courthouse, and you almost end up with an area close to that historical marker right there. Huh? Oh, they were the people who murdered part of the gang that murdered John Wilson. In Tom Clark's gang. Now this is the yeah. One of the things I find interesting is he never mentions that I have found yet Tom Clark. He has mentioned before Bert Hayes, but he doesn't mention Tom Clark. Even though he was living within the whole area between the courthouse and the cemetery the night that Tom Clark's hanged. So, I mean, he knows about it and all that stuff, and he does write a story about the murder, but he never mentions Tom Clark. Found that very interesting.
It could be on the microfiche.
It could be. It could be.
We're looking.
As Bub in the Toledo Blade, Hyde wrote he was a sure shot, which speaks to the lawness of Lauderdale County in 1863. And I wrote that story on the Mushoes National Heritage blog. So if you ever want to just read one of his stories, you can go to the blog and see what his stories are like. Now, of course, I added my own 2 cents. You don't have to pay no attention to that. But he talks, in that story, he talks of an outlaw gang and a man named P who returned home to take vengeance on the outlaw gang. I think this is important because there's a lot of oral histories that talk about the retribution that happened in this area after the Civil War. And I think every bit of it probably has some semblance of truth. I don't think people really have embellished that. When I look at the Booger saga, I have constantly finding newspaper articles that reference the same stories back from that time. So I don't, now you can get into the, he said, she said about the stuff about who was wrong, who was right all day long. Did stuff like that happen to a great degree? I would say, yeah, it did. Hyde also talked about forgers. He had a couple stories, well, more than a couple, but I'll just tell about a couple of them. Apparently his aunt had sent him to the soldiers' camp in town to find out what had happened to their black and white pigs. The soldiers offered up some pork to him, saying, would you like a black piece or a white piece? The 2 pigs were black and white, as you can imagine. Another time, all the family had left was an old duck. The Union Army had taken everything. and the soldier began to take that duck off. Another soldier, feeling sorry for Hyde and his family, pointed out to the other soldier, "You don't want that bird, it's an Alabama water buzzard." And the soldier let it go. Anybody notice that I have butchered somebody's painting? So, it's not, I didn't want to do an AI thing and actually make it look real, but this is Mapleton, and he had a little story about Mapleton as the Bohemian. He said, "The house is one of the oldest and finest of the antebellum residences in the city. During the North and South War, and when the Federal General Dodge was making his raid through the Tennessee Valley, Mr. Hanna hosted the British standard over his domicile, and forthwith the Yankee Raiders began to twist the lion's tail with a 2-gun battery and placed its order so close to Mr. Hanna that Mr. Hanna replaced his English flag with some nice bed linen, and the shelling ceased." Now, it's really important to understand the context of this. General Dodge had actually sent a 2-gun battery when he's covering for Straits Raid and weighing waste to the Tennessee Valley on the south side of the river. He wanted the city of Florence to surrender. And they fired a couple shots, white flags went up, sent the boats over, and they said, "We want you to surrender." The mayor says, "There's no troops here. There's nothing to surrender. There's nobody over here." And the Federals looked around. Sure enough, there's nobody over there. They go roll back across and tell Dodge, and Dodge says, "I don't care. I want a surrender of the town." So they start shooting again. Flags go down, and finally the city of Florence says, "We surrendered. What do you want?" That's right. It's humorous in a way. And but there's an important story to tell, because either through Dodge's actions of doing that, Forrest anticipated that Dodge was worried about General Van Dorn's whole division coming down and getting in his rear. And Kurt's nodding his head. You can see a military guy, he's thinking, this is what I'm worried about. And Dodge admits this in his memoirs. If you go look at his memoirs, and so what Dodge does is at the Battle of Town Creek, he breaks away the next day because Forrest has sent a regiment of cavalry as a diversionary tactic to fire across the river at South Florence, where the flags went up again. We repeat the same thing. And Dodge thinks that there's a whole cavalry force trying to get in his rear. And he retreats back toward his base in Corinth, thinking he's recovered Strait well enough. And the long story is that helped Forrest break away and go after Strait a lot quicker. Another story Bub told was an artillery piece being captured by Union soldiers that had been mounted near the piers of the railroad bridge that had been burnt just recently by Helm's cavalry. He noted that the artillery piece came from an ironworks 3 miles north of town. So there, to give an idea in his writings how often soldiers would come in town, as Bill McDonald would say, changing hands constantly during the war, especially in 1864. Bub had this story to say, and I quote, "Several of our old and prominent men of affairs were discussing the political situation. Among the number was an old and honored Israelite. The sentiment that prevailed was union. The old Hebrew had left the group and was crossing the street. When near the middle, he stopped and looked up the street and discovered a large cavalcade of rebel troopers. He rushed back to the small knot of citizens and exclaimed in an impressive manner, 'Gentlemen, the politics of this town got to change blankety blank quick.' And they changed." He also tells a story about the horse captured at Mrs. Christel's at the corner of Mobile and Poplar Streets, which was taken by Charlie Hooks and Newt Rogers. Newt Rogers succeeded in crossing the river with his horse, but Charlie Hooks didn't. He had to hide out in the old McKinley house that was still standing at that time. Later, it would accidentally be burned down. Do any of y'all recognize that place there? That is if you're on the old Huntsville Road going east, Yeah, it's just across from David's Baptist Church. That hill right there, he will mention several times. He'll call it Turner's Hill. Uh, but there was a couple things that happened there. That's also, if you ever come across Raccoon Branch or 4 Mile Branch, Raccoon Branch, 4 Mile Branch. That is the area that's so. Now, when we were kids, that area wasn't filled in. It was very rugged, uh, ravine, and it's an ideal place for an ambush or to uh, stop a pursuer. Uh, After this article, he corrected a mistake that he made from that article, and he noted this right here. He said, Captain Roberts, commanding companies A, C, and F, composing the picket posted to guard the ferry at Bainbridge, was captured by the 4th Alabama Cavalry of General P.D. Roddy's brigade. Then he uses the words, in Captain Roberts' account. Now, he doesn't talk about the event, but it's important because he says there's an account out there. He's writing this in 1906. So now, if you're a historian, you're saying, hey, I got an account of something nobody really understands where it was at. Where did this capture take place? And after you look at that account, when you can find it, I actually didn't find the first account, found one that was written of it 20 years later, but it basically puts you in this spot right here. But I want to read you the first words that's a picture of Captain Roberts right there. He said, the morning of May 7th, 1864. Now, let me interrupt here. He is at the patent plantation. That's where they're camped, okay? The morning of May 7th, 1864 dawned clear, warm, and beautiful. The air was filled with the odor of violets, columbines, and milk-white plum tree blooms. The birds sang sweetly from the branches of the freshly budded trees in that sunny southern land. All nature seemed to smile, and it was hard to realize that this peaceful scene was soon to be disturbed by the mad sounds of war. I had gone up to my breakfast with some other officers at a house nearby, and we had just seated ourselves at a table which had on it hot biscuit, coffee, ham, eggs, and fresh sweet milk. I remember these things because in the weary months of imprisonment that followed, that delicious breakfast was never tasted using to haunt my dreams in my waking hours, and I resolved that if I ever did get free again, the first thing I would do would go back down into Alabama and finish that breakfast. Now you can see this stuff. There's some more. The narrative is really good. I wish I had time to read all of it, but I'm hoping that the original narrative is even bigger than the edited one. That same location I just showed you, there was another battle fought there just a few months prior, and Bub was wanting to know about it. He knew where it was at. He'd heard the shooting, the firing, all that. And so he asked some if the old soldiers knew who fought the battles on the Posey Farm or the one that was fought between Wilder's brigade and Roddy's command east of Florence. And the battle, as it is known in the official records, is the Battle of Sweetwater. Now, everybody knows that this ain't nowhere near Sweetwater. This is where the battle is. And it occurred on the 25th of January, 1864. Bub, he was frustrated because one of them had said that, called him a Johnny, and there was a reason he called him a Johnny, but said he told him the battles at Shoals Creek wasn't nowhere near where he talked about, which was Raccoon Creek. So Bub goes, now Mr. Anderson, that was the guy's name, was the one Federal killed in that immediate fight, or was it not a lieutenant who was bushwhacked soon after the fight, one of the boys, and the one who shot the rebel captain told my father, whom he met in Huntsville a few days after the fight, that they had not a man scratched. The fight occurred 3 miles west of Shoal Creek. The Rebs were in the woods on the north side of the road and the Federals on the south side in an open field. The Rebs said the Yanks had the advantage as they were so situated they could shoot a man's head off every time, one of them peeked behind a tree. The Posey farm, where the other fight occurred, is about 2.5 miles from Florence. That fight occurred on October 30th with Croxton's cavalry and Hood's forces. One of Wilder's boys, and speaking of the raccoon fight, says, "We called it Shoal Creek," and he also calls me a Johnny. Both are incorrect, neighbor. The battle occurred 3 miles west of Shoal Creek and 100 yards east of Raccoon Creek, 4 miles from Florence, while Shoal Creek is 7 miles distance. Though I was not in the engagement, yet I could hear the guns distinctly. My father was in Huntsville on that day, it being occupied by the Federals. So you can readily see I am no Confederate. The one thing about this is when you read some of the narratives about the 92nd Illinois, like this diary that 3 years with the 92nd Illinois, a couple of regimental histories, this matches up perfectly where this battle site was, 100 yards east of Raccoon Creek or branch. So it helps in marking spots that you want to tell. Unique things that Hyde told. One of the things I think is most great, I finally get to use this laser pointer. I've been wanting to do this the whole time. There's the pontoon bridge. This is a map that was drawn by the Federal Coastal Survey, which was Navy engineers. And they basically show the pontoon bridge going to Patton Island right there. And then the Confederates said, this is Hood's pontoon bridge in November 1864. And then they built a trestle bridge across. And so some people in their histories of Hood's campaign will say this is the pontoon bridge was attached to the railroad bridge piers. That's not the case. As an engineer, I'm going to tell you, you don't attach anything upstream of a flowing current, would be downstream. And there's a reason, I won't get into that, but there's a reason why that mistake occurred. But what's interesting, nobody ever talks about this. Think about what Patton Island was in 1864, or even today. In 1864, it's a bunch of fields. They're planting crops on it, stuff like that. Now you got heavy Army wagons. A whole army's got to march across that island and get to the other side. What's there? There's an old corduroy road there that the Confederates built. And Hyde points that out. I never even thought about that needed to be a possibility, but I thought that was a cool story. The other thing he tells about, and this is the first instance that I had found this in print. So in 1890, he's saying in 64, when Hood's army was crossing on the pontoon bridge going to Nashville, Lieutenant Ford of either Tennessee or Illinois Cavalry, I did not know which, floated down the Tennessee River one dark night for the supposed purpose of cutting the bridge. But from some cause the mission failed. He hid himself in one of the boats, but a Negro betrayed him. He was captured and executed. He was the weather-beaten trooper that asked for information when the boys searched our old dump cart. Now, this Lieutenant Ford was with the 12th Tennessee Cavalry, and he was executed for being a traitor. And there are a number of diaries, narratives that validate this story. The newspaper accounts come after Hyde publishes his story. I have not found anything published before this. The one thing, and there's diaries that mention it that people published later, but one of the General Irving Walker, Colonel Irving Walker of the 10th South Carolina, he was on the court-martial board, and he found out that he had done this. He had tried to come down and float down the river all the way from basically east of Shoals Creek in the middle of November in a cold, fast-moving river, and he got up there and he was going to cut that pontoon bridge. And he said, I would have pressed to release him. Anybody that brave to do something, try to do something like that. Anyway, so much is war. There's a long story I could tell you about this guy. You know, maybe we'll get it all out there one day. But speaking of the old dump cart story that he talked about, it was really interesting because he said him and his brother took a dump cart and put a false floor in it so that they could hide the pork when they went out to ask for help from the surrounding farmers. And they would put like corn, stuff like that at the top. And he said they were stopped by the 12th Tennessee Cavalry and they searched the cart, didn't find their pork, but they wanted information and he gave it to them. And it's funny because the 12th Tennessee isn't in our area very much, just in the November of 1864. And they reported that when Forrest did his raid, there was a couple, they got information that Forrest had just passed through Florence. I always wondered if maybe that was the same thing. Who knows? One of the things he talks about is the Christmas Eve and Christmas Day shelling of Florence. Now, Florence got shelled on Christmas Day, and it got shelled 2 days later. It didn't get shelled, so his timing is a little bit off on all this. He helps because he gives little details that helps with other narratives. Like he confirms that Colonel Patterson's cavalry was here as part of supporting the guns that were moved down here. He would tell he had some color to things in the Toledo Blade. He wrote, the result of the land-water battle was one company of rebel cavalry routed, the rebel battery knocked out of time, 2 rebels killed, 4 wounded, and a section of backbone taken from Jeff Davis's Monopoly. Great Scott, those shells were about as large as my mother's washpot. And if the noise terrified men, how can anyone wonder at 2 boys, myself and older brother, aged 15, were the only members of our family at home, our aunt having taken the 2 younger brothers and fled the day before to a place of safety. But few people remained in town, and those that were lying low in cellars or getting as many brick walls between them and the danger as possible. One amusing incident I recollect that day, when a large shell exploded in the air, an aged and terrified darky explained, for the loving Lord, them Yankees is going to whoop for sure. They shooting from the water and the heavens too. Oh my God. And then another shell exploded and Hyde City fled. Did everybody recognize, this is the last story and we're through. Did everybody recognize this place here? The roundabout in East Florence? Up on that hillside, this is the one thing that I found in the Reaper. I found he talked about the Bohemian, and I found he talked about as Bub. And it's about an execution of a Confederate soldier. And I wonder, after reading all this stuff, I think he must have known something. Either he met the guy before he was executed, or he actually climbed a tree and saw the execution. I don't know, but it really bothered him about this. And so he had as a Bohemian, he made this comments. He said, near the residence of the late Mrs. Shaw, and before I finish, David has helped me find this spot, so I want to recognize David Gregg over here. He said, years ago, how many I do not know, stood a handsome residence along the old cedars known as the Munn Place, and to the south an apple orchard remained until after the close of the war. Every vestige except the cedars of this once home of plenty has disappeared, and few remain who know of its having existed. Near where Mrs. Shaw's residence stands, a military execution occurred during Hood's advance into Tennessee in 1864. A soldier whose home was near Gadsden was shot for absenting himself from his regiment without leave, and his remains lie buried at the spot of execution. The drumhead court was held in the officer's tent, which was situated in a cluster of large cedar trees a few yards from the mouth of the little ravine. It was just a tragedy of war and nothing more. And knowing this, what you always want to do is you want to say, is there other narratives out there that can support this? Captain Marshall, I wish I'd put that other painting up here because we could help you sell more of them. But Kurt did a painting of showing the Confederate battery shooting at the Union gunboats coming up the Tennessee. Marshall wrote a very good narrative on that event. And he had this to say about that execution. At Florence, the battery assisted for the second time at a military execution. And as before at Shelbyville, not a man present except those under compulsion of superior authority. Wholesale killing on the line of battle had not made men bloodthirsty, though they might witness a legal execution without much civilized emotion. That's all he wrote about it. This guy wrote, several thousand words about his action there. But there is one guy that wrote a bunch about it. It was Commissary Sergeant Newton Coker of the 39th Georgia. He wrote a 724-word narrative on this that gave credence to everything Hyde wrote. And I'm just going to read the last part of that narrative. But the discipline of the Army must be maintained at whatever cost. Next came the command, fire. At the word fire, the reports of 12 guns rang out on the still air and reverberated around the surrounding hills. But the man did not show any signs of having been hit by the bullets from the guns of the men who fired at him at a distance of only a few steps. What did it mean? Had they all missed him? And if so, did they do so on purpose? No, he had only been hit by at least a portion of the balls, but as he did not fall, one of the men was ordered to reload his gun and shoot him again. When this man fired, I noticed the condemned man shrunk a little, but still maintained almost an upright position. I thought it might be on that account of being tied so securely to the stake that was what prevented him from falling, but another man was ordered to reload his gun, which he did, and walking up close to the man, shot him in the head. Then the poor fellow fell over to one side, and I turned away, perfectly sick at heart. It was the most cruel execution I ever saw. And so, that gives, when you find stuff like that, Hyde writes here, and when you can find other stories that matches the kind of things that he wrote, it's real easy to start saying a lot of his stuff is accurate on what he wrote about. DeForest Hyde died at home in South Florence, 3rd March 1919, after a long period of ill health due largely to stomach trouble. His obituary would talk of his association of the newspapermen of his time, and then close out with the following words. His death removes an old landmark of the bygone days of Florence. Peace to his ashes. And him and his father, his mother, his wife are supposedly buried in the Florence Cemetery. I don't believe their graves are marked.